o'clock to 7 p.m.
Oh, they don't listen to
Good afternoon, can everyone hear me? Welcome to Africana Studies. It's great to see you all here. I know this is a busy time in the semester. I'm Monica Levin, an Associate Professor of Africana Studies. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be able to introduce today's guest. This event is over a year in the making because Professor Jackson was scheduled to come last year, but weather forced us to reschedule that, so we're happy to have him here finally. Before I say a bit about Professor Jackson, I want to acknowledge our co-sponsors, the Jewish Studies Program and the Department of Anthropology, and I want to thank Jonathan Boyarin for collaborating with Africana to make this event possible. I'd also like to acknowledge our ASRC staff, Treva Levine, Renee Milligan, and Lynn Lopper for all of their help in putting this together. Professor Jackson's visit is a featured event for my Being and Becoming Black class, in which our students have engaged some critical questions around African diasporic identity construction. So it's great to see those students here, and I want to encourage you guys to ask questions during the Q&A, okay? So, John L. Jackson Jr. is Dean of the School of Social Policy and Practice and Richard Perry University Professor at the University of Pennsylvania. His research in visual and urban anthropology examines racial and class-based differences in contemporary urban environments with a focus on how urbanites themselves theorize and deploy those differences in everyday interactions. His scholarship uses multimodal research methods to extend and expand critical race theory as an analytical and explanatory framework for understanding contemporary social conflicts. Jackson's books include Harlem World, Doing Race and Class in Contemporary Black America, which was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2011, Real Black, Adventures in Racial Sincerity, which was also published by University of Chicago Press in 2005, Racial Paranoia, The Unintended Consequences of Political Correctness, published by Basic Books in 2008, Thin Description, Ethnography and the African Hebrew Israelites at Jerusalem, which Harvard University Press published in 2013, and then a book he co-wrote with journalist Cora Daniels, Impolite Conversations on Race, Politics, Sex, Money, and Religion, which Atria and Simon Schuster published in 2014. Jackson's next book is titled Televised Redemption, the Media Production of Black Muslims, Jews, and Christians, which he's co-written with Carolyn Rouse and Marla Frederick, and that's going to come out later this year from NYU Press. Professor Jackson is also an award-winning filmmaker whose films include Bad Friday, Rastafari After Coral Gardens, which I highly recommend, Divided We Stand, and Get It Together. Much of Jackson's work critically explores how film and other non-traditional formats can be most effectively utilized in specifically scholarly research. He's one of the founding members of CAMRA, CAMRA, and PIVPE, two Penn-based initiatives organized around creating visual and performative research projects and producing rigorous criteria for assessing them. You have to forgive me, I'm losing my voice after 2 classes this afternoon. So in addition to what I've just read, Professor Jackson's official bio, I'd like to say a bit about why John Jackson is an anthropologist who pushes the limits of how we conduct ethnography. To do that, I hope you'll allow me to turn very briefly to his works. With an enviable effortlessness, Professor Jackson is known for employing what we call thick description in a manner that is beautifully executed. He does this brilliantly, balanced with theoretical rigor and a keen awareness of the precariousness of the anthropologist's positionality. I'd like to share an example from his second book, Real Black, Adventures in Racial Sincerity. Jackson begins that book quoting an interviewee named Bill. I'm reading from him here. Look here, let me tell you something, Bill says, wiping down the counter in front of him with a frayed and dirty white towel, in another uncanny example of those sometimes short-circuited differences between people and their things. The towel matches his own gray-haired scraggliness. It is a resemblance that I jokingly point out to him just about every chance I get. Bill even laughs occasionally, grudgingly, almost agreeing with my not-so-innocent comparison. But he also blames me for his tattered, rag-like state. Me and people like me. Quoting Bill again. And I'm serious about this, he continues. Serious as cancer about this here. So listen to me. Listen good to what I'm saying. You think you have all those degrees and letters behind your name, and people like you think you're a big shot. I don't care about any of that. None of it. It don't mean nothing to me. Nothing, absolutely nothing. Many of us have encountered experienced moments like this while conducting field work. But few of us are courageous enough to situate such a moment as a springboard for a theory of racial sincerity, Jackson's framework for interrogating racial authenticity. And those of us who've read Real Black and Professor Jackson's other books interpret this moment with Bill through the lens of his professional persona, that of someone who decidedly does not come across as a big shot. In fact, when I teach Professor Jackson's work, I always discuss his alter ego, Anthro Man, who appears in Real Black. In his first book, Harlem Work, Jackson wrote about the challenges of commencing fieldwork in Harlem, and this is what he said. I was truly dumbfounded by how little my knowledge of, quote, the literature on Harlem and Black America prepared me for actual fieldwork. Moreover, I had a specific and personal problem that, although under-theorized in anthropological discussions about fieldwork methodology, seemed to be my biggest ethnographic Achilles heel. I was terribly shy, and shyness is a self-inflicted death blow to any self-respecting anthropologist. John Jackson combated that shyness by creating Anthro Man, an ethnographic superhero who is part Harry Potter, part Huckleberry Finn, part Franz Boas, part Zora Neale Hurston. Anthro Man has an anthro sense that tingles and vibrates whenever valuable anthropological data wafts through the air. I wish I had thought of that. Whether we can credit John L. Jackson or Anthro Man, those of us working within the profession are thankful for the fruits of these merged personae. So Professor Jackson's lecture today is entitled More Than Meets the Eye, What Studying Black Israelites Helps Teach Us About Identity. Please join me in extending a warm Africana welcome to Professor John L. Jackson.
That's really one of the best introductions I've ever gotten. I almost feel like I can't speak after that. So, first of all, I do want to say thank you very much for not giving up on this. We tried this before, it didn't work. I'm super excited about this project, though I also have to admit I haven't spoken about the Hebrew Israelites in a little while. So I was trying to kind of remind myself exactly what I wanted to tell you all today, and I think I remember. I also am a little tired, and so what I want to do is I want to be able to move around a little bit, so I want you to tell me if it's better to move around with the mic or before you answer. Or if you think because sometimes I project. I can also project because speaking more loudly also will keep me awake. So I'm almost happier to just project if you can hear me in the back. Can you hear me? Is it okay? Yes. Okay, excellent. So if it's a problem, I can go back, but I'll start here. It'll keep me awake. All right, so I'm going to really just make 4 or 5 basic moves at this talk, right, which is why I don't have to write it down. And I want to start with what for me is one version of the origin story for my own investment in studying sort of Black Hebrewism, Hebrew Israelites, Black Jews. We can talk about differences in terminology if you want. And it really begins, there are tons of other origin stories that the other writers do a much better job at describing. So if you want to sort of think about the 19th century roots for African American investments in various forms of Hebraic identity and identification, people like James Landing, people like Jacob Dorman, there are tons of folks who do this work, and they do great work. For me, my interest really started when I was in graduate school. And I was working in Harlem. And I was struck trying to figure out exactly how to be an anthropologist, and I still wasn't comfortable talking to people yet. I had to figure that out. Didn't have my Anthroman stuff yet. But what I wanted to understand was how one of these groups, a very sort of sartorially, spectacularly dressed group, soapboxing on 125th Street in Harlem, could reconcile what I thought were 2 very different and seemingly, I think, irreconcilable kinds of ways, ideological positions about race, identity, and contemporary American society. So, in one register, it was clear that when I listened to this group of folks who call themselves Hebrew Israelites on 125th Street in Harlem in the 1990s, there was a version of their rhetoric that almost seemed like Black nationalism. It sounded very familiar. Right, the critiques of whiteness, of white America, the ways in which they wanted to understand African American agency, even militancy, as a function of all they had to deal with in their passage in life. But they did that move at the same time as they were adamantly and unapologetically anti-African. So for them, what was striking, and they're saying this in African Square, right, on 125th Street, right, renamed African Square, that Africans were different peoples. Africans were Cushites, they were Hagarenes, they were Hamites, they were maybe Ishmaelites, but they weren't Israelites. For them, that was the most fundamental, ontologically hard and fast distinction you could make. And so they were making a case, basically, that African Americans weren't African at all, but that was a lie. No connection. Right? So even their reading of the transatlantic, I mean, so this is, you can imagine I'm walking down 125th Street, right? So their reading of the transatlantic slave trade was basically some version of Arab, Muslims, and African pagans selling Hebrew Israelites into slavery. Anything else they argued was a lie, a misrepresentation of the fact. And they argued purposefully so. Right? That was their claim. It's all a conspiracy. Now, part of what I thought was fascinating about this was that they still had a commitment to diaspora. So we're talking to that. And even would have a clapboard where they would show you where the 12 tribes were. The 12 tribes. But what was fascinating about it was it connected African Americans to indigenous population communities all throughout the U.S. and to other slave communities in the Caribbean, Haitians, Jamaicans, but completely short-circuited Africa at all. So they had a notion of diaspora. It was linked to a version of reading, a kind of racialized reading of history, but without recourse to Africa at all. Right? I thought that was incredible. How do you pull that off? Now, putting aside how you pull that off, how do you try to make that case on 125th Street in African School? That's where I was like, I have to understand who these people are and how they got here. Now, ultimately, I thought my story would begin and end with the group I saw on 125th Street. But I soon realized they weren't nearly the most interesting iteration of this, what I think is a kind of global, four-continent-wide commitment of Africana subjects thinking about themselves as descendants, and the basic claim that various forms of Hebrew Israelite communities are all a little bit different in terms of what they believe and how they operationalize those beliefs. The basic claim, though, is descent from the ancient patriarchs. Now, they problematize that, and I'll sort of end on that later, but that's the starting point. And so I was fascinated with this group and how they were able to pull off this interesting kind of rhetorical gymnastics between black nationalist rhetoric, but really pushing back against any discussion of Africa at all. Right? Not historically, not genetically, not genetically. Africa was different. And so how do you do that move? And one thing that came up over and over and over again when I studied this group is they would invariably invoke another Hebrew Israelite community, had a slightly different history, came mostly out of Chicago, not New York City, but they were in Israel, and they had nothing good to say about these crazy people who call themselves Hebrew Israelites. And so it came up enough times. I said at some point, when I was actually writing the second book, I said at some point, I have to just go visit. I just have to put some faces to all these characterizations because it's just so fascinating. But even before I did that, I was really taken, and this is sort of the first major point I want to make about the Hebrew Israelite community, how they get us to think differently about questions of race, that when you study groups like this, what you see, in a sense, is culture and cultural change in hyperdrive. Right? So usually part of what we feel about culture, we call it second nature anthropology, is there's something about it that's so naturalized, we can't see that it's always on the go, right? It's always moving, it's always changing, it feels very static, even when it's not. When you study a group like this, you realize their practices, their beliefs, their cultural universe can change radically in an instant. And so there's this one moment I feel like telling them that and portend some of what I think the version of Israel and other things I learned about the Hebrew Israelite community could help to reinforce. And so it was still in the 1990s, and what I ended up doing was going, the former research I did with them was basically going to their nightly worship services on 125th Street. And they're really called classes, and they're all structured basically the same way. Actually, be split into like this, men on one side, women on the other. And there usually be three high priests at the top, usually elevated, just like you all have, you're ready to go, actually, right? And they would have a lesson plan for the day, and they'd be behind a big table, and they'd probably spend 15, 20 minutes talking about that, really try to explain some points they want initiates to get through. And then when it's done, they have some time for questions and answers. And I remember there was one moment, I thought it was a very powerful moment, I read a little bit about it in the book, when one of the newer initiatives, actually Puerto Rican member of the community, raised his hand and said, I want you to find the section of the Bible for me where we explain how and why we render descent patrilineal. And so one of the things they did is, for them, being an authentic Hebrew Israelite, to even be a member of the community, meant you had to have a father who was also Hebrew Israelite, which for them, again, is a proxy for black, right? Black in the U.S. So if you're mixed, and it's your mother who's white and your father who's black, you're fine. The other way around, doesn't matter how much you want to be in the community, you can't belong, right? Because you don't fit the patrilineal model. So, but he didn't have the text. So you want to figure out, like, how do I get them? Folks are asking me where that's from. It's not how they understand Jewishness or record identity, so I need that data. So the priests do what they always do. They would do this even if probably asked them what time is it. They would always take 5 minutes and just confer a little bit. Right? Talk, you sit and just wait. And in this instance, they were done. The high priest comes forward and said, you know what? We want to start by saying we were wrong. That it's not our place to be genealogists. That we were wrong when we told you, you have to figure out and ferret out who is or is not authentic based on who their father and mother was. And the example he brought up, and I've never forgotten it because at the time it was so powerful. I mean, they clearly were using it for its rhetorical force. He said, the person can walk in here and look like George Bush. And as long as they feel the spirit, as long as they hear the message, that's it. It's not a responsibility too fast to figure out if they're genetically, patrilineally, authentically Jewish. That for them was a sea change. It was a sea change. Because they had spent a lot of time policing the point of entry into the community. There was a lot of, there were tons of folks who are angry about that. Now we can talk about how and why they changed it. At college they talk about this almost as sort of interesting kind of Pentecostalization of Hebrew Israelite. Whatever you might describe it as, this was a moment where they said we were going one way, now we're going the other. And it's an example of how and why there are so many different versions of Hebrew Israelite communities. Because for a lot of people, George Bush or George Bush-like folks can't be in that room. That their project was a decidedly racialized project that disqualified folks in ways that had to be independently verified. And so they were making this move and they lost tons of community members who just refused it. Right? So they would start their own camp. We would call them camps in New York. They would start their own camp and say, well, the high priest went wrong. And that splintering kept going in New York, in Chicago. But part of what I think it at least demonstrated for me was the fact that this was a group trying in a very self-conscious, purposeful way to reconstruct itself on the move and to make sense of itself in a changing cultural and political landscape. And we can talk a little bit more after how and why they made the decision, but they made it. And trust me, it was a radical one for them. Now, this is about the same time when they're telling me that the folks in Israel, a little bit before this, I talked about how they invoked Israel, the folks, the Hebrew Israelites, who share some common history, but talk about them in unflattering ways. Well, one of the things that you should also know is that these two communities have very different ways of understanding Africa and the place of Africa in their notions of Hebrew Israelite authenticity. So I've already described a version that says Israelites and Africans are very different, discrete, separate. For the folks who left Chicago, they left Chicago about 1967, and only about 400 people in 1967 left with their Mashiach, their Messiah, a guy named Ben-Ami. His name had been Carter before there was an foundry. And I always tell people he actually died right after the book came out. And I always would almost teasingly tell people I was very happy that Anthroman had met Ben-Ami as an anthropologist with an agenda working at Duke, who was just trying to get some data. Because even at 66, 67, I could see, looking in his eye, why people would sell everything they own, ignore the jeers of their friends and relatives, buy Sears and Roebuck tents and hightail it with their students, which is where they were. And you could see there was an electricity and energy, even at 60-something years old. And so they followed this young upstart. This is a young guy who had barely been in the community in Chicago. He had basically been a player, a grifter before then, kind of a con man, but found the truth and jumped into it, right? Latched onto it for dear life. And for the first part of that, most folks thought he was just running another con. He can't really be serious. But he kept with the argument, kept making the case that they should leave, over and against the protestations of the senior priests in Chicago. So in Chicago, they've been talking about the potential of leaving America and going back to Africa for a long time, right? Now, already, when you think about folks going back to Africa, that's not the Hebrew Israelites in Harlem. They're not going back to Africa. That's not where they're going, right? But these folks had been part of a longer tradition of back to Africanism, and they had been talking about it, but it wasn't the time. They're waiting for the ships to touch sheets and other things, but it wasn't the time yet to go after. Ben Ami said, these folks are nuts. You know, he had a visitation from Angel Gabriel. He told them now's the time we're going to go. So he got a basically kind of ragtag band of folks to go with him. And first, they didn't originally go to Israel. They weren't even thinking about Israel, actually. Right? This was a back Africa project. So they ended up, after doing a little bit of research, taking a couple of trips in Liberia. In the Liberian jungle is how they describe it. And for them, it was kind of like going from the frying pan of racism in the U.S. to the fire of just trying to make ends meet and survive without electric refrigeration, without stoves, without any of the things they needed as urbanized coming from Chicago. And so within 12 months, 3/4 of those folks were back in the U.S. And they were like, we didn't sign on for this. Folks were dying, dropping down wells, getting sick. They could not handle it, partly because they refused to integrate. So this is a time when African leaders, including the head of Liberia, saying, we'll accept African Americans, except some of them said as many as they want, as long as they integrate, right? As long as they become part of the project. And some would argue, and some did make the case in places like Ebony Magazine and Jet, that what African Americans should do is stand up and fight in the civil rights movement in the U.S., fight for their citizenship there. Don't come here, but if they come, we'll accept them, right? We'll integrate them into our society. That's not their project. Their project was to come and be set apart. And so they took land no one else had, they couldn't even buy it, so they had to, interesting part of this is all the versions of histories of African American sort of separatist and back to African movements actually become the supports for a lot of this project. So the reason why they even had the land they were able to procure, because an old Garveyite who had left for Liberia long before and was a citizen could buy it by proxy. So he really owned it, let him work it. When they were too tired to work, they'd go back to his home, rest a little bit, and go back and forth. And so for the Hebrew Israelites, their project is one that said, let's build our community out in the Liberian jungle. And that's what they tried to do. They cleared brush, they built schools from scratch, but it was really hard living. And they realized they weren't getting the kind of traction they needed. Now, while this is happening, they also don't have a ton of money. Ben Ami takes folks over, but ends up staying in the U.S. just to try to fundraise. So this entire time, and one of the things that's fascinating about this community, maybe the second major point, is they're really good at understanding the value, not just of their American identity, which they renounce periodically over the last 40 years, we can talk about that too, but playing off of the power of transnationality. Right? So really working their transnational networks. So while the community is trying to build in the Liberian jungle, there are folks sending money back all the time, going back and forth with resources, with food. And Ben Ami is getting word that the society, those small communities, seems to be falling apart at the seams. Right? Folks are leaving, either integrating back to the Liberian community, going back to the States. The way they were trying to pay for it, they were trying to kind of make ends meet financially. There are two prongs to their sort of financial solvency project. One was, and they're still famous for their Hebrew singing gospel choirs. And so just so happens that a lot of the early migrants were pretty big time, either studio recording artists or actual recording artists in Chicago who did the blues, who did jazz, who did soul. And those folks ended up touring Africa, touring Europe, and sending money back to the folks in Liberia, just to try to keep their heads above the water. They didn't do that to this day, really. But really, it was incredibly important early on. And the second thing they tried to do was find some trucks, find some stoves, find some way to cook some southern cuisine, right? Soul food from the U.S., and to try to sell that, right? They had soul food and burgers. That's what they did. Right? That's what they knew. That's what they knew. And both of those are interesting for different reasons when we move to the present. We'll get there very soon. But they get to Liberia and they realize this isn't working out the way we want it to work out. And Ben Ami feels like, wow, this is not right. This is a failure. Like, folks are at each other's throats. They're not happy about the project. Tons of people have left. This doesn't, looks like it's going to be another unsuccessful story of African Americans attempting to go back to the U.S., right? bracketing out the founding of Liberian American Colonization Society, help from the U.S. government and all that. But then he has, he says, his second divine intervention. First one was the Angel Gabriel. Second one was Martin Luther King Jr. And the way they tell the story is somewhat apocryphal, but I describe the various iterations of how this could be sort of accurate or not in the book, is they're listening to sort of staticky transistor radio versions of King's final speech, where he talks about going to the promised land. For them, it hit that in that moment. They said they never thought about it before, really, but in that moment they realized if they've been claiming that the reason why they're calling themselves Hebrew Israelites is because they come from the ancient patriarchs, then West Africa wasn't their home to begin with. So their job was to get home. So the final 100 or so Hebrew Israelites kind of hobble themselves from Liberia to what they re-geographized. It's southern Israel, but what they've geographized as Northeast Africa. And that's where they've been ever since. The first 100, probably more like 4,500 now, maybe even 1,000. They've had over 1,500 births in Israel alone. And that transnational link to the U.S. is now just not to the United States, but also to satellite communities all throughout Africa, all throughout Europe, and even all throughout the Caribbean and South America. And so they find a way. The reason why, as someone who's interested in media communication and project, they're particularly interesting to think about, is because it's hard to do a traditional ethnographic project unless you imagine all you're going to do is work in the Kafar, in the Negev, in Damour, which you can do. And I actually have one student there now doing that kind of work. But really, to make sense of how and why they're interesting to think about, you have to realize they're really a decidedly transnational community, always moving all the time. So at one point, and this number might be stale now, but when I was still doing research on the community, at any given moment, more than 1/3 of all the adults in the community was somewhere else in the world, training other people to reproduce the stuff they were doing. For them, that was a testament to their ability to be industrious, to find ways to build community, even in spite of the fact that when they got to Israel, they had a very complicated, it's getting a little bit less complicated, but at first an incredibly complicated relationship to the Israeli state. And part of what happened was, when they first arrived, they kind of got the same response that the Ethiopian Jews got when they arrived, which is, you really don't have evidence, you don't have paperwork to support the claim that you're descendants, but, you want to be here, we have a process for that. You can symbolically convert. And what's interesting, and I didn't know this until we really started digging, was that, the first, few folks, and so the way they got into Israel, of course, was there wasn't 100 people walking all at once, right, into Ben Gurion International Airport. They went in drips and drabs. And so the first few, before Ben Ami even knew, had started the process of symbolically converting. This is what you do. Right? Like you said, Ben Ami said, we're going to be here. This is what they're telling us to do. It was only once Ben Ami got there that he said, absolutely not to be doing this. Right? Then, for at least 2 reasons. One, he claims, and they claim it to this day, it would be conceding to the assumption that they weren't who they said they were. Right? So they weren't going to do that. And he stood by that for a long time. But the other part of what people say is if they do convert and become Jews, now, there are ways in which they could still have their Ben Ami, but what's Ben Ami's role in that society, right? Does that change? I think potentially it could. Potentially it could. And so when he gets there, he says absolutely not, which means they're at a stalemate. And they were at the stalemate for over a quarter of a century, where they were temporary residents who basically were squatting, having overstayed their visas. So it meant they couldn't work, at least not legally. It meant they really had to be careful about anything they did outside of their community. It meant not leaving if you wanted to come back, or at least come back without any sort of fulsome kind of effort to sneak yourself back. And so we're talking about 25 years where they were very performative about the idea that, we're not American citizens anymore. Right? Literally burning their passports, right, as part of that demonstration, their renunciation of their former lives and citizenship. But they weren't willing to convert. And so what you had, and this part of the story is really fascinating, is you had this complicated sort of dance around the community, finding ways to sustain themselves, besides the gospel choir that sings in Hebrew, besides the food, which they're still doing, although at this point we'll talk about how food investments change very fundamentally in ways that are very important to the narrative. But one of the things you realize at this point is, they're in a position where the only thing they imagine they can do is hold their ground and find some way off the books to sneak some funds into the community. So one of the things they're famous for, so even to this day, if you went and visited, and they're incredibly good hosts, always tell people they love visitors and they can treat them very well, is they'll take you out to the desert in the Negev and let you meet African Bedouin. And they do have often some of their most substantive relationships, not with Ethiopian Jews, so they'll tell you why they think that is. Maybe somewhat with other Israelis in Dimona, but really the folks that they will tell you they're most connected with are the African Bedouin. And the reason why, they'll say, is because they spent the bulk of that time off the books illegally building homes for the Bedouin. When the Israeli state said, we need a domicile, we need to know where you are so we can tax you, we can take the census, all that kind of stuff. And so they actually used some of the skills they started to forge in Liberia to find a way to become useful to the African Bedouin in the Negev. And that's really how they made the bulk of their funds and how they were able to forge some sort of community with some of the local residents in and around Dimona. But what was also fascinating was, while this is going on, the Israeli state is still a little anxious because the rhetoric of the community at this point is incredibly forceful and exclusionary in a lot of ways. Right? So this was a racial project. They were leaving a racist America. Now again, some people already picked on them for leaving at all. Other people are digging in their heels, they're fighting in there, they're trying to transform the country, going to hightail it to Liberia. So we've had that critique of them. But once they got there, part of what they knew their project had to be was to find some way to create a space for them to really thrive. And it meant, the African Bedouin home stuff, that was fine, but they would do other things as well. And one of the things they would do is find sometimes pretty big corporations willing to allow them to work en masse off the books for cash. And then what would happen periodically is there'd be an international sting operation for the Israeli government, US government, and they would find these folks, lock them all up, get all the paperwork in order, and ship them back to the United States. So like 40, 50 at a time. For a relatively small community, that was a huge hit. Now, what they're infamous for was that they were very good at always sneaking themselves back. And invariably by illegal means. We're talking airline ticket fraud scams, money laundering rings. I mean, there are court cases all throughout the U.S. and Europe around the nefarious and illegal activities they did to get back to Israel. And that's what they did for 20 years. And they were very successful at it. And that dance, right, that back and forth between sort of being in Israel, trying to find a way to make a way, but also being quite clear about the fact that there's something about how you're rendering or reckoning your own identity that seems to be saying something very anti-Semitic, or at least anti-Jewish about the folks already there. That was a very complicated maneuver for them. It's actually a maneuver that is really interesting given the kind of evolution around their commitment to the Israeli state, which I'll end on as well. So part of what they're a really good example of as well is a community that has imagined they're going to do anything they can to really forcefully create the kind of community, the possibility they want, in spite of various nation states allied against them. Being pretty adept at pulling it off. Now, part of what I think, and this is maybe another major point I just want to pause on for a second, part of what I think is really important about the community is that they've been incredibly keen on being self-conscious in terms of their own investments in the racialization of their project, right? So when they left, basically the rhetoric was, we are the, descendants of the ancient Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem. You all must therefore be imposters. We're home. You can leave. You imagine that goes over super well. Not only that, you're intimating that you're the spear of a much longer sword. There are millions of black folks coming behind them. Oh, again, Israel 1967, right? I mean, we're talking about, this is a country that's just reconfigured itself. They don't know how legitimate, how crazy, how accurate these representations are of this coming potential migratory threat. And they're not sure how to negotiate this. And so one of the ways it plays itself out, and the community is very good at trying to thematize this themselves, is what they would argue is the difference between their relationship to the state, qua state, and the relationship to local Israelis. So they would say they've always had wonderful interaction with Israeli neighbors, I mean, warm, kind, friendly, that really the threat and fear was negotiating the state apparatus. And for a number of reasons, being very suspicious, paranoid, and committed to doing anything they needed to do, even and especially illegal things, to try to thwart the gaze and the interests of the Israeli state. And for that matter, the U.S. state at the same time. Now, what I find so amazing about it, and this I do think is something that one can study more, is this community is very good at either you'd frame it as either walking a fine line or being able to always have their cake and eat it, right? Being able to negotiate differences that other folks can't negotiate well, right? And one way to talk about this is to say that even as they were consistently renouncing their connection to the U.S., they were very good that entire time at working the U.S. system, right? At working with Congressional Black Caucus, local aldermen in Chicago, to do things like, get funding for a brand new $2 million building just for their students for school in the moment, bankrolled completely by the U.S. Congress. I mean, so they're really adept at saying, well, what do we need, and how can we await that I would argue isn't inauthentic, but it's just really creative of being able to work both sides of an issue. To the point where really, I think, to think about them now, I think you'd have to talk about them as a community, really, that has their most intimate connection with African Bedouin, but also with a lot of Palestinians, especially Palestinian activists. You go to sort of old Jewish, you go to Old City, they'll take you to, rec rooms that they built for some of the Palestinian activists. And it's clear that there's warmth there, and it's clear that there's history and backstory there. But at the very same time, they are unabashed in their commitment to the sanctity of the Israeli state. So much so that without any challenge, they were willing not too many years ago